Hello, and welcome to the Critical move of Telesur. The International Labour Organization warned that, as a result of the pandemic caused by the novel coronavirus, the labour market in the world is going through an unprecedented crisis. What factors affect this crisis? What policies are adopted in each country to mitigate this situation? Where do we see better results and where not? What lessons does this situation leave us with from a geopolitical point of view? Let's deploy the board. It starts the first move. Speaking at the ILO Virtual Summit on July 8, Director General Guy Ryder said that several world leaders have called for a comprehensive strategy to mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 on the labor sector. According to the UN agency, the pandemic caused a 14% drop in working hours during the second trimester of this year, equivalent to 400 million full-time jobs, meaning 48 hours a week, almost 100 million more than estimated. This pandemic has generated a social and economic crisis, a crisis of unprecedented proportions in the world of work. We have never seen anything like what happened in the last 6 months. The first point is that this is a real global crisis, with 93% of the world's workers living with labor restrictions. All countries are affected. More than 400 million full-time jobs were lost in the second trimester, in contrast to the estimate, which was around 305 million. This was due to a 14% decrease in the working hours worldwide. No country can solve this crisis alone. We're in this together. Strong and effective multilateral solutions are now more important than ever from the outset. The UN has called for massive support for the most vulnerable people and countries, a rescue package for at least 10% of the world economy. Developed countries have stepped up their aid to themselves, but what we are promoting are solidarity mechanisms to ensure that developing countries benefit as well. Over 136 million people are employed in the health sector. All have the right to decent working conditions and protections of their health and safety, especially during this crisis in public health and health systems. Jobs and the economy are closely linked. The economic policies the government decide, both behind the scenes and in coordination with others, will help shape our long-term recovery. We can rebuild economies that are more resilient, more inclusive and more sustainable, or risk long years of stagnation. To lay the foundations for a strong recovery, countries' monetary, fiscal and trade policies must move in the same direction. And this must be accompanied by labor policies and social investments to ensure that no one is left behind.
I believe we should think about building a recovery.
I believe we should think about building a recovery where everyone can benefit from the changes. For hundreds of millions of people, this would mean good jobs with fair wages. Building a bridge to recovery will require social and environmental solidarity. We will only succeed if we work together, and for that, strong partnerships between government, international institutions, employers, and trade unions will be essential. This ILO Virtual Summit took place between July 7 and 9, with the aim of addressing the effects of the crisis unleashed by the COVID-19 pandemic, with special emphasis on the economic and social context. Here the summary of the meeting. Heads of state and government, as well as prominent business and union leaders participated in the international event, discussed various strategies to re-energize labor systems in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. They also discussed the vulnerabilities highlighted by the outbreak of the novel coronavirus, in particular the lack of social protection, the informal economy, inequality, and climate change. Among the points discussed were the need of people who work without social protection or in the informal economy, the promotion of full and productive employment and sustainable enterprises, the adoption of measures aimed at ensuring the poverty reduction, the promotion of equality and the fight against the adverse effects of climate change and central other recovery process, and the measures that can be taken by the international community to promote the implementation of the United Nations Sustainable Development Agenda 2030. This teleconference was attended by leading leaders of the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. In his closing address, ILO Director General Guy Ryder highlighted what he sees as a high degree of joint commitment and determination to overcome this crisis. In the same line, he assured that his handover will facilitate progress that will lead to a more favorable situation, and he added, "We have very effective mechanisms to return to normal in the world of work. Some of them are very familiar to us, such as social dialogue and international labor standards. We also have an additional, somewhat innovative asset. We are aware of its effectiveness as a roadmap for appropriate actions in the future." For his part, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, "Recovery from the crisis does not mean having to choose between health or employment to the decrement of the economy. All these areas are mutually related." Guterres said that there is a strong starting point to facilitate action and solutions, such as the declaration of the 10th anniversary of the ILO, the 2038 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and the MD goal of decent work and economic growth. The Director General of the World Health Organization, Tedros Adhanom, called on governments, employers, and workers' organizations in the sector to develop effective and sustainable programs in each nation to protect their health workers. What if we map out the impact of the pandemic on jobs? World unemployment in figures. According to estimates by the International Labour Organization, total hours worked worldwide fell by 10.7% in the last quarter, representing the loss of some 305 million jobs. In the particular case of America, the ILO estimates that the loss of working hours reached 18.3%, with a reduction of 80 million jobs. These are the countries most affected in the region. The United States, just over 1.3 million people applied for the so-called unemployment benefits last week. Mexico, official data revealed on Tuesday indicates that 12 million Mexicans have lost their jobs since March. Colombia set a record with an unemployment rate of 21.4% in May, the highest in a month. Brazil, the unemployment figure in this country reached 12.9% between March and May, the highest in the last 2 years. Peru, the National Institute of Statistics and Information Technology, reported that unemployment during the quarantine period between March and May was 13.1%. Argentina, unemployment rose to 10.4% in the first trimester of 2020. Chile recorded an unemployment rate of 11.2% between March and May, the highest figure in the last 10 years. In Europe and Central Asia, hours worked decreased by 13.9%, which would be equivalent to the disappearance of 55 million jobs, followed by a 12.1% decline in working hours in Africa, resulting in the loss of 55 million jobs. To the list is added the Middle East region, where the loss of working hours stood at 13.2%, with the disappearance of 10 million jobs. It is important to clarify that the 305 millions the ILO speaks of were just estimates, but the reality is different. It's 400 million jobs that have been lost in the second trimester of this year, according to statements by the International Labour Organization itself. I invite you to read the article titled Work and Pandemic, written by Gabriel Silva Luján and published on the Colombian digital website El Tiempo. The adverse consequences of the pandemic have occurred in all areas of social life, but in no area has been so severe as in the labor dimension. In the short space of a few months, the world of work has been turned upside down. The severe demands associated with the control of the coronavirus have also served to make the pandemic a screen for a profound effect in the workplace. It is clear that the economy labor market policy has been strongly biased in favor of the employer, since in such a recession with unprecedented levels of employment, it can act comfortably to ensure that the adjustment to the crisis is primarily in hands of the labor force. The first trend that can be clearly seen is the deformalization of work. All of a sudden, companies migrated with astounding effectiveness to teleworking. Surveys and evidence show that more than 50% of employers have already made the decision to keep remote work unchanged and to do it indefinitely. Some analysts estimate that more than 100 million square meters of office space will remain vacant worldwide. This is obvious. Teleworking has brought a dramatic transfer of business operating cost to the home. Although teleworking can bring productivity advantages, it has already opened the door for workers who had a formal employment relationship for years to become contractors and have their work paid on a piece rate basis and on a task basis rather than on a daily basis. Working from home usually extends the working day, increases utility and food bills, and consumes unpaid hours of rest and privacy that belong to the family. Although there are honorable exceptions, companies are taking cost outs of teleworking that are not sufficiently compensated to the worker. Another component of the deformalization has to do with wages, the temporary voluntary reduction of salaries, which thousands of employees have accepted, risks ended the principle of the irreversibility of contractually agreed remuneration conditions. Moreover, the push to deepen wage integrally is already being left, which means lowering the minimum wage levels the possibility for employers to get rid of loan burdens, with the excuse that the poor must be taught to save. Finally, among the many concerns raised by this issue are the constitutional conquest of the right of association, to unionize and to strike. It is not easy to workers to organize if they are seen with their colleagues only in virtual conferences controlled by the administrators, or if they really have the opportunity to air their complaints and objections among themselves by digital means. It is up to the state, then, to prevent the emerging from the pandemic of a new ad hoc labor regime that openly discriminates against workers and reverses decades of progress in formalization. I suggest you to read this article completely, which is Colombian. There you will find references to the situation in that South American nation. Let's take our first break in our critical move. Remember, there's a strategic move in social media for you to participate with us. In addition to showing profound health deficiencies, the COVID-19 pandemic has worsened labor inequalities. According to ILO, over 400 million jobs were cut in the second trimester. What happened to those workers? Who's protecting them? Leave your opinion. Let's take a short break. We'll be back soon.
Estamos firmemente convencidos
We are firmly convinced that the response to the economic crisis, the social crisis resulting from the COVID health crisis, must come from the agreement of all the social agents. In Spain, social dialogue has been key to the whole process of measures to combat the crisis.
La pandemia también ha demostrado
The
cuánto
pandemic
dependemos de
also
las cadenas de
demonstrated how much we
suministros
depend on
mundiales
global
para acceder
supply
a
chains
equipos de
for
protección
access to
personal de
personal
alimentos
protective
y otros
equipment,
bienes y
for
servicios
food and other
esenciales.
essential
Es por
goods and
eso que
services.
necesitamos continuar
That's why we need to
trabajando
continue to
juntos
work
para
together
abordar
to
todos los
address all the
impactos
economic and
económicos
human
y
impacts
humanos
of
de la
COVID-19
COVID-19
and design advanced solutions for sustainable recovery.
We have an immense task before us.
Tenemos una tarea inmensa frente a
We have an
nosotros para
immense task
construir
before
una
us to rebuild our shattered lives and economies.
The African continent has so far
El continente africano ha tenido
The
tasas de
African
infección
continent
más bajas que
has
muchas u otras
low
partes del
infection
mundo,
rates than
pero
many other
debido a la
parts
debilidad
of
de
the
los
world,
sistemas de salud,
but due to weak
las
health
limitaciones de
systems,
recursos y
resource
las
constraints, and
vulnerabilidades
pre-existing
económicas,
economic
el impacto a
vulnerabilities,
largo plazo de la pandemia
the
en
long-term
África
impact of
será
the
bastante
pandemic
grave.
of Africa will be quite severe.
quite severe. The African Union has developed
La Unión Africana ha desarrollado
The
una
African
estrategia
Union has
contra
developed a
COVID-19.
strategy against
Como parte de
COVID-19,
eso,
and
ha
as part of
establecido un
that,
fondo para ayudar a
has
los Estados
established a
miembros
fund to
a
help
financiar
member
una
states
respuesta
finance
efectiva
an
a la
effective
pandemia.
response to the pandemic.
an effective response to the pandemic.
Deshalb kann ich nur begrüßen, dass die ILO
Acojo con beneplácito
I
el hecho de
welcome the
que la
fact that
OIT también ha
ILO has
desarrollado
also
directrices
developed
sobre
guidelines
seguridad en
of
el
safety
trabajo
at
durante
work
la
during the
pandemia,
pandemic
porque es importante
because it
evitar
is
que el
important to
coronavirus se
prevent the
convierta en una crisis
coronavirus from
social.
becoming a
Solo
social
podemos
crisis.
hacer eso
We can
con
only do
amplio
that
esfuerzo
with a
comunitario.
broad
La
community
pandemia
effort.
nos muestra
The
una
pandemic
vez más,
shows us
aunque de
once
forma
again,
dolorosa,
though
cuán
painfully,
importante
how
es para
important it is for
nosotros
us to
trabajar
work
juntos.
together. We
Necesitamos
need
que
international organizations like ILO
sean un motor
to
para
be a
desarrollar
driving
mejores
force in
prácticas y
developing better
estándares.
practices and standards.
Rusia concede especial
Russia
importancia
gives special
a la
importance to the implementation of the concept of better work on the basis of the declaration of the ILO, its guidelines from an effective strategy to overcome the consequences of a pandemic in the interest of improving working conditions, introducing innovative technologies to normalize labor relations, and stimulating job creation. The spread of the COVID pandemic has had a strong impact on the socioeconomic environment. Let's review the context. The crisis caused by the novel coronavirus is described by experts as an unprecedented event in the modern economy, and is probably the biggest since the Second World War, or even since the Great Depression of 1929. As a result of the decline in demand following the containment measures implemented, the sectors most severely hit have been commerce, hotels and tourism, manufacturing, real estate, and administrative activities, according to the ILO reports. In this context, the novel coronavirus is hitting hard the pockets of the most socially disadvantaged people. The International Organization warned that, as a consequence of the dramatic increase in poverty, the World Food Programme declared in April that the next pandemic could be hunger. The Latin American region is now the epicenter of the pandemic, with more than 3.5 million of positive cases and 150,000 fatalities. The application of wrong policies by neoliberal governments, the fragility of the health and social security systems, as well as weak and dependent economies, have led to the shaping of the socioeconomic environment that will hit its population hard. A report by the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean predicts that due to the crisis, extreme poverty will increase this year by 28.5 million people to more than 96 million. For the region, which was already experiencing headwinds with respect to the expansion of its economy, the omens are not at all encouraging. If one takes into account the contraction in the prices of raw materials, the decline in international demand caused by less activity, and the uncertainty at a global level. As part of this impact, it is necessary to mention the drastic reduction of staff in private companies, the increase in demand for delivery or home delivery services, but to the disadvantage of the health of those who carry out these jobs, who are poorly paid and exposed to contagion, as well as the consolidation of the variant of employment known as teleworking, which does not always take into account the maximum number of hours of work per day, working hours and compensation, in some cases, less than the one received by the worker while performing the same task in person. We start the analysis. We have from Argentina Carlos Villalba, psychoanalyst, journalist, and also from Bolivia Gabriel Villalba, expert in geopolitics. Welcome both of you. Gabriel, if you allow me, stay the first minutes with Carlos from the point of view of psychology, labor psychology, if we can call it that way, how these situations have been seen by the society, not only in Argentina, but also worldwide. Hi, hello, how are you? Thank you for having me one more time with you, and also with you, all of your viewers. Well, the impact, the Colombian report, I think I've always been very careful of being reiterative. I always say the same that the virus doesn't cover the poverty and inequality on the society that already existed before the virus. The virus not only as a bioeconomical phenomenon that generates a health crisis, that it was supported on an inequality situation and on also financial. And it's right what you were explaining before. I like to say something before going beyond. I think it's very important to try to explain how are the figures that are given to us. Technically, they could be correct in function of some criteria, but in reality, it's different. In Latin American and the Caribbean, we have, according to the figures that multilateral organisms have, we have 290 million workers unemployed and 25 million unemployed. So that is that the bad news is that it's not like that. Those 290 employers, 150 are informal workers, are workers without rights, and the ones who have jobs, the true ones, 13 millions, they earn less than the limit in the poverty. So that is the true situation. That's the real situation. It's not the virus, the one that generated this phenomenon. The virus, what did was to worsen this situation. You were mentioning the 55 million of jobs that were lost in the region, according to the ILO. And I point out a very important point. Informal workers during these months, they lost the 80% of their incomes. So every time that someone says that I'm working in the yard of someone's place, what they really means is that some workers that hadn't the chance to do that. When a man and a woman says that they have long hair, that means that the hairdressers weren't able to work. Every time that someone says that had to throw out the papers in the backyard, that means that those are workers that recycled among the streets of our cities in Latin America didn't have the chance to do that, their job. So, excuse me if I start this way, but I think that this is the main picture. Well, that is practically the other part of the analysis that I like to talk about. It's the ones that are invisible, because obviously, as they are not registered, the so-called informal workers, well, they do not appear on their reports. But when you go into the reality, well, then you realize that the figures of informal workers, it's way more alarming than the ones that is offered by the reports by these international organisms. Thank you so much. Stay with us for a couple of more minutes. I want to bring into the dialogue to Gabriel. Gabriel, Professor Ward he was talking about an aspect that is unquestionable, that it has to do with the informal workers, also with the increasing of poverty and increasing poverty given because of, as he said, there was a considerable invisible poor that this virus just have brought into light. This increase in poverty hasn't been given by the pandemic, but by the policies that have been applied in the context of the pandemic. I'd like you to help me to analyze a parallelism between the governments. Which governments were more prepared for this situation? Well, first of all, greetings to you and your program, and from my friend from Argentina. Well, without a doubt, we have to make an analysis of the world capitalist system. It was already immersed in a financial, economical declared war way before the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, what this COVID-19 pandemic did was precisely to make visible these big cracks that already existed in the planet. And without a doubt, there has been some economic tendencies, protective tendencies that have come to minimize their inter market. And there have been governments who has been more prepared to face this pandemic. And also, when it comes to policy of labor policies, states and governments who has focused in generating opportunities for everyone, same opportunities, and strong currents of supporting their workers. Those have been the most prepared governments. I'm sorry to interrupt you. You told me about those governments who had applied protective measures. It comes to mind the government of President Donald Trump that had a flag campaign back in 2016, and when he came to the White House, and when we see the reality in the United States, we can see that it's the epicenter of the pandemic. With all the consequences that comes along with it. Yes, I was telling you that the epicenter of the pandemic, along with all the consequences that brings with it, I'm talking about the United States. Yes, without a doubt, you have to take into account the fact that, for instance, England is applying measures of code of nationalism. We can see also in Bolivia or Venezuela, in Latin America, and in the south part of the world, we can see that 15 years ago, this protection, this strong protection, and these strategic measures have been coming back to face this pandemic and on its negative factors revolving the labor situation. We are talking about what's going on and what we are seeing, these new tendencies. It's a strong state. The pandemic has shown that if we don't have strong health systems, everything falls apart. The private sectors are having big issues in the socio-economic situation and epidemiological. Thank you, Gabriel. Professor Carlos, to follow up with this idea, is it the protection, is the key of success of these governments to face a pandemic of this magnitude and at the same time to protect the workers? Or is it in the application of right policies and social programs? First, Ray, I think that answers, as they have been different when we overcome this pandemic, because the pandemic will come to an end at some point. It's going to have different answers. More recommendations, for instance, that the ILO made in its recent summit. I like to point out something, and I agree in part with what Gabriel says. The 88% of state support to all policies that have already going on in the midst of the pandemic. This started with countries with high incomes. That means countries with high wealth. Those are the ones who do that, and they do it in that direction. So my opinion has to do with a long saying that says that the states, they don't call it to invest, they call it to spend. Spending something that doesn't earn benefits. That is the contradiction. I always talk about it. I tell about it to Professor Pablo. He says that what has to happen from this moment on is this intervention by the states in the market, and that the states invest in a way it thinks it's better for the population and secondly for workers. And that means that not only what traditionally is called as or is known as public service, but also the construction of a production model that can be exclusive, that reflects the well-being of workers. And obviously many other measures, talking about our own region, in countries that has an external debt so high as the one we have. It is terrible for being able to pay it, and I think that we have to sub-regionalize the demands in our countries, and we have to get the finish of the debts to be able to finish these investments. If we don't discuss these things, it's going to be very difficult to discuss the other things. Also, there's a tendency that is, when in space, is we're talking about a universal wage or a basic income that may be at least at the level of the poor. And these measures has to be taken into consideration. Most of countries are already in this side because, as a paradox, in European countries, it's been easier. It's where are they getting all the resources to be able to make all these investments. Thank you so much, professors. European countries that right at this moment they are arguing if they're going to give green light or to stop that famous millionaire budgets to bring out of the water the European Union. And the group of 27 has practically been divided into two sides, because the ones who have been with more comfortable, they consider that this should be made throughout loans, and those countries that have been left behind a little bit because their economical systems are a little bit more weakened. But there are a group of countries, leading with Germany, a strong country, but that is trying to bring together some considerations. So Europe is in the middle of this debate. Gabriel, talking about this issue that professor was talking about, protests in France. By the way, I forgot about it because of the situation of the unemployment. So professor meant about a fact that in this context of labor policies, and this is that we need the forgiving of the debts, but not only the forgiving of debts, but it is also needed to strengthen the unfair commercial and financial blockade that is upon countries, that because of other governments, such as the U.S. government, which one obviously affect the application of policies that could support in a much better way the worker class. What is your opinion about this? Recommendations that I all made, they're talking about reconfiguration worldwide around the policies for the workers, and they talk about the big consensus between the public and private sectors. The state, the public, and the private should be the center of what should rule these policies and to generate a new panorama. Labor international environment, we have live in a multilateralistic situation in which what big hegemonies are not the same they used to be long ago during the Cold War. We have a multipolar world without a doubt, and it has to find new ways of organization. The UN must be think through once again, and this social paradigm, neoliberal standards, flexibilization in the labor sector has failed. Strictly neoliberal policies and free market has failed worldwide, and that's what this COVID-19 pandemic has shown us, how the state as the protective labor rights. You're talking about the flexibilization of labor. It's failing. Now we're talking about the teleworking. Exactly. Yes, that is correct. The unemployed and people who does delivery services, when they are infected, when they turned out positive, they don't have security. People who work for McDonald's, for Burger King, they don't have insurance. At any times they can be fired. So these big issues are the ones who has to get back into the global argument without historically wind benefits. Thank you so much, Gabriel. And also I thank very much Professor Carlo for your time for this critical move. For both Villalbas. We have the same nicknames, but we don't agree. We don't agree in everything. Let's take another break in a critical move. Remember, there's a strategic move in social media for you to participate. In addition to showing profound health deficiencies, the COVID-19 pandemic has worsened labor inequalities. According to ILO, over 400 million jobs were cut in the second trimester. Here, I will make it clear that these are data provided by the International Labour Organization on the basis of so-called stable jobs. But we have here an element of which Professor Carlos Villalba spoke about, and it is not taken into account, and it has to do with informal workers. This means that the figure is way much higher. What happened to these workers? We'll be back soon. The crisis arising from COVID-19 is outlining two models of actions by states: cooperation, multilateralism, and solidarity, mark effective actions in the face of the pandemic, versus governments that prioritize shielding their economies while putting the population in the background. The response of capitalism to the COVID-19 has made clear what the real priorities of the system are in this matter in the context of health crisis. The image of several governments fell with the collapse of their public health systems and the slow response to prevent the spread of the virus, a situation that has generated high numbers of infections and deaths in nations such as the United States, Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Peru, Spain, and Italy, among others. With their policies focused on the privatization of resources and the decentralization of the state, these countries have prioritized saving their economy and avoiding a collapse in the line over human health. In the United States, Florida is now the new epicenter of the pandemic after the state of New York. Federal action has been more than deficient. Proof of this is the number of positive cases, which already exceeds 3.3 million, and there are more than 40,000 fatalities. On the other hand, the position taken by the president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, generated great controversy. His denial of the COVID-19 has provoked popular repudiation in the country that reports the most cases in Latin America, with more than 2 million people infected, including the president himself. After the flexibility of quarantine measures and the increase in mobility, there was an outbreak in some countries, an uncontrolled rise in others, and therefore the increase in cases has been exponential. Experts agree that this crisis will accelerate the shaping of an increasingly diverse world, where nothing will be the same as before the pandemic. They add that the COVID-19 has shown that the U.S. supremacy is a thing of the past and that neoliberal globalism is falling into disarray. Others are less optimistic, considering that capitalism is taking advantage of this context of crisis to reinvent itself. We continue with the analysis we have from the U.S. Ramon Grossenvogel, University professor, expert in issues on decolonization of power and knowledge. Professor, a protection that safeguards the economics or protection to the worker. Where is the key to slow down this phenomenon which one the International Labour Organization is already alerting? Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. I think that it depends on what place in the world we are, but I think that protection to work and the workers is something very important in the world. Also, the protection to national markets also in countries of the third world, because if you don't protect your national interests, well, what happens is that competition, international competition, and win and throwing workers out into the streets because national industries are breaking. We have seen that before. They have implemented in Latin America and African Asian policies which what they have done is to destroy national economies and privilege investment of international investment and transnational industries of the first world who are investing and start devouring all the national industries. So in the third world, if they protect the world but don't protect the workers, well, it affects everyone. So these two things are linked. If we see the behavior of countries in the first world, we are seeing that they are abandoning the classic neoliberal policies. What they have done is to go back to the state to save their companies, to save their economies, to save the 1%, not to workers, but also is an issue of the state transferring wealth. What they are doing is transferring the riches to 1% of richer people. We have seen that in the United States. They have divided $4 trillion to save transnational companies. An international bank that during this crisis has gone broke. So right now, there's a hypocrite economy in countries of the first world, on imperialist countries that are going back to protective measures of market to somehow to save the national economy, to nationalize companies and transferring wealth to the richer people. We saw this coming even long before the pandemic because of these protective policies of Donald Trump, who was he was closing to the international exchange that was proposed by neoliberalism. Donald Trump, what did was to create protected in the United States, trying to save the industries and employments in jobs and in the United States. And in the same time, they ask neoliberalism for countries of the third world. This is in question every day. Neoliberal policies are getting weaker by the day. specifically because in the first world they're working. And to demand neoliberalism and regulation of market in other countries, when you do that on the international field, well, it loses all credibility and, let's say, a sort of moral justification to the ones that propose it, who propose it. This is not new, because in the capitalist world, we always have seen through history that during these moments of regulating financial capital, usually when they go into crisis, into world depression, the states go back to regulate financial markets to save the capitalism for the capitalists. That practically comes to answer a doubt that I have from our first analysis, because my guests were explaining that the more solidified, economically speaking, they were the most prepared to face this pandemic. But however, as you are saying now, those states coincide with countries that shows the highest figures of unemployment and on positive cases by COVID-19, because they have public health systems that are not enough to supply the necessities of the population. And such is the case of the United States, which is the epicenter of the pandemic. And if we go beyond indoors in that nation, we see that there is no solution to the issues of that population or the ones who have been affected by COVID-19. I mean the positive cases, and I mean employers who have been left without jobs. Yes, that is correct. United States is the epicenter of a great global depression and also of the crisis of the coronavirus pandemic. It's the epicenter right now, as we speak now. United States has lost more than 50 million jobs in the last 2 months. United States has the highest figures of positive cases and also the highest death toll. And not only has the highest figures, also in the United States this epidemic is just starting. I mean, while in other countries they are in outbreaks in other phases, because new outbreaks have appeared, and then because of they finish a phase and then suddenly some other positive cases appear in other parts. Well, United States has been the same process that has started to increase without stopping. Right now in the United States, the figures of the positive cases of coronavirus are, let's say, geometrically increasing by the day. We're talking about figures such as 80,000 positive cases per day. And it has been spread to a lot of states all over the United States. So this pandemic is just starting in the United States. I mean, the United States is the epicenter of the great global depression, because they have lost a lot of jobs and also the pandemic. But why does this happen? Just one reason. The United States doesn't have a public health system. They have a private health system. And that means that the profits are more important than lives, and this is why these things happen. This is why a lot of people are dying, because hospitals collapse, because there are not enough ventilators, there are not enough hospitals or beds in intensive units, and that's why we see these horrible scenes where doctors in those units decide who lives and who dies. So this answer to something you were saying before, and it is that President Donald Trump applies protective policies, but protective for the companies, not protective for people. In just 1 a minute. I'd like you to give me your opinion on this. What happens with these alarming figures, which the International Labor Organizations talks about these lost jobs in this last second trimester in these years? To keep on talking, using the same language of the United States, they say these are collateral damages. They're just going to remain just like that. Is there any hope for this situation? That is the struggle of the peoples, because I can see how one is going to get out of this, because the powerful ones, how can they save all the working class that are going to a precarious situation of unemployment in the streets? Right now, the United States have divided $4 trillion just for rich people. But to the poor people, they haven't received almost anything. So this is like some sort of mocking, because the only thing that left in the United States is the struggle of people. The powerful ones, by their own initiative, they can adopt an attitude of mercy for these people who they themselves explode. I think we're talking about a situation right now where we are going into a depressive, a critical phase, where capitalists, where there's going to be a fight for state policies. And what usually happens is that states end up interfering to saving capitalism from the capitalists, such as in the 30s, in the last century, where neoliberal policies during the first 30 years of 20th century, they have to abandon that, because otherwise the capitalist systems would collapse itself. And what that means is they only want to have benefits for themselves, and destroying the capitalism itself with its own success. So what they did was that to go back to state policies. The United States and Europe and in different places, they impose what they call policies that well-being state, trying to stimulate the economy through transferring some wealth to working classes to increase the markets, and that way to recover the capitalism. But that policy, it depends on social movement that today in the first world, so far, especially in the United States, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist a working class movement such as the one that existed in the 30s. So what is going to happen if it was for the capitalist system? As long as it doesn't feel pressure on workers to make changes in the policy, it's going to be very hard for those policies to face in this depressive crisis. What can happen is an authority change, face it. That it's what we are seeing right now in the first world, a turning of authority persons such as Trump with a racist speech. What he's doing is to generalize the discontent of people. A system that has taken away the resources. We're talking about migrant workers, which he considers an inferior race and have caused the loss of their jobs. This is the message of the fascism, racist. And this kind of speech is a speech that sadly the white working class of the first world has benefited from exploitation of imperialism in their own countries and in other countries. Sadly, they channelize the discontent against other workers. While that things happens, it's going to be very hard that there is a political movement that puts in check the state and makes significant changes of the policy of these states. And others in parallel keep on being visible, the figure of states, understanding it and this apparatus that goes beyond the executive power. Thank you so much, Professor. Till next time. Let's go to conclusions. In a context of strong weakening of capitalist centers since before the crisis generated by the pandemic, a parallel crisis arises, the one about the unemployment. The number of jobs suppressed today is 100 million more than they expected, that is 400 million during the second trimester of 2020. This tells us how serious this situation is, a situation that, as a domino effect, leads to a considerable reduction in purchasing power, loss of labor rights, and therefore social security. Besides, this means an increase in the levels of poverty. In whose hand is it to stop this crisis? Who is in charge of application policies of protection to the working and pensioned class without leaving out the so-called informal workers? Who is responsible for auditing the correct compliance of the regulations in labor matters? All of these questions find one and only one answer: the states, as well as those countries whose executive and legislative powers have made inclusion their backbone, their reason for being. For today, we close the geopolitical world.